I was still sitting at the mahogany dining table when I realized my family had already erased me in real time. The crystal chandelier above us chimed softly every time someone laughed, as if the house itself approved my humiliation. My father's voice cut through the room, sharp and rehearsed, as he told our guests I was the least successful child he had. I did not react. My mother followed immediately, praising my sister Alina's bright future, while ignoring the fact that every dollar she spent on that future came from me. Across the table, the elite guests smiled into their crystal glasses, completely oblivious to what they were witnessing. Before I tell you what happened next, comment below where you're watching from and hit subscribe because what this family did next will leave you speechless. I kept my hands folded beneath the tablecloth, my knuckles white against the silk as I recorded every word in my memory like evidence. The mahogany surface in front of me felt less like a dining table and more like a courtroom built for my silence. They thought I was shrinking. But inside, something precise and dangerous was aligning, like gears locking into place after years of friction. I studied my father's reflection in the polished mahogany, noticing how easily he performed cruelty for an audience. No one at this table knew I controlled $2,147,000 in offshore assets tied directly to their survival. And yet I said nothing because silence, carefully documented silence, was the beginning of everything I planned. The air in the room felt glacial, broken only by the soft clack of cutlery against pristine china. I already knew how this story would end. They just didn't know it yet. I remember the exact moment the room stopped feeling like a family gathering and started feeling like a staged performance built entirely for my disappearance beneath their approval. The sound of my father's laughter echoed off the mahogany walls, each clack of his glass against crystal sounding louder than my own heartbeat, which I kept deliberately steady, controlled, unreadable. I watched my mother's smile tighten whenever she looked at me, as if my existence required correction, while Alina basked in the light of inherited favoritism that tasted like debt disguised as love. I didn't move, because every second of my stillness was another page of evidence being written against them in silence, without them ever noticing, not even once there. But beneath the table, where no one could see, my phone vibrated once against my thigh, the screen lighting up with a cold, unfamiliar notification that did not belong to any contact I trusted. The guests continued smiling, their crystal glasses chiming softly, completely unaware that the foundation of everything they believed about this family was already beginning to fracture in ways they could never reverse. I felt no urgency, only a slow, deliberate shift inside me, like something once broken aligning into a sharper, more dangerous form of itself. I slowly recognized that something irreversible had already been set in motion. They're lying about everything. I was still holding the vibration of that unknown message in my mind when I arrived at the luxury brunch my family called a celebration for Alina. The air inside the glass-walled restaurant was glacial, filled with the soft chiming of crystal glasses and the scent of overpriced vanilla perfume that clung to everything like a mask. My mother's voice cut through the laughter as she pointed at Alina like she was presenting a prize no one had earned. Alina smiled, adjusting the tailored designer jacket that I had paid for last month, completely unaware of how every stitch carried my money and my silence. I kept my hands folded beneath the pristine white tablecloth, my knuckles white, chest steady, observing how easily they turned my existence into background noise. Mother leaned toward me, her voice sweet but edged. "Maya, you've always been so independent. That's why you don't mind helping your sister, right? She deserves a little support, unlike your stressful little corporate life." My father laughed, the sound echoing sharply against the chandelier above us, as if my value had already been decided and dismissed. "She's strong enough not to need attention," he said, raising his glass of crystal whiskey. "Not everyone needs recognition to be useful." I felt something inside me shift, not outwardly, but in the way cold decisions begin forming without permission. The brunch conversation blurred into noise as I silently logged every transaction, every expense, every moment of dependency I had been funding. They didn't see me as family. They saw me as infrastructure, and that realization landed in my chest like ice. The chandeliers glittered above the table as laughter clacked around me, while outside the world continued moving without knowing the fracture forming inside this perfect image. But the message in my mind kept repeating, sharper with every second, as if someone had opened a door I was never meant to see. I watched Alina laugh again, her voice too loud, too rehearsed, while my mother's hand rested proudly on her shoulder like she had built something valuable. I noted every gesture, every smile, every lie disguised as affection, because now I understood the pattern clearly. They were not celebrating her. They were replacing me. And then my phone vibrated again beneath the table, sharper this time, like it refused to be ignored. I didn't move, only lowered my gaze slightly as I read the preview of the message, without touching the screen. It was the same unknown contact, but this time the words felt heavier, almost final in their implication. They are not just lying anymore, they are preparing to erase you completely, and the next move will decide everything I thought I already controlled from here onward right now. The moment I read that message under the table, something in me shifted into a colder register, as if my emotions had been placed behind glass. I didn't react outwardly at Alina's brunch, where the chandeliers chimed softly and crystal glasses clacked against porcelain, but inside, I was already recalibrating everything I thought I knew about control. That was when I first saw him.
Richard Hale.
He entered like he already owned the air in the room, tailored suit sharp enough to cut light, confidence spilling into every step across the polished floor. The temperature of the space felt different immediately, not warmer, not colder, just artificially elevated, like a performance beginning before anyone realized the stage had changed. My father stood up faster than he had ever moved for me in my entire life. Richard Hale, he said, almost reverent, as if the name itself carried weight I was supposed to recognize. I stayed seated, my hands folded, knuckles white beneath the tablecloth, observing instead of reacting. The smell of expensive cologne mixed with the brunch perfume made the air feel dense, almost suffocating, as if reality itself was being layered with illusion. Richard's eyes landed on me briefly before he smiled in a way that didn't reach anything real. "So this is the famous family," he said lightly, his voice smooth, rehearsed, calculated. My mother laughed immediately, the sound chiming too quickly, too eagerly, like she had been waiting for this approval to arrive. Alina adjusted her posture as if suddenly aware she was being evaluated. My father gestured toward me without looking directly at me. "And this is Maya, corporate strategist. She handles internal operations." Richard let out a small chuckle, echoing softly across the table like a controlled insult. "Corporate strategist," he repeated, tasting the words like they were unimpressive currency. Interesting title for someone in internal administration. A few guests laughed. The sound clacked against my awareness like broken rhythm. I felt the temperature inside me drop, not emotional but precise, structural. Glacial clarity replacing anything that could be mistaken for uncertainty. Richard continued, leaning slightly forward, his voice now carrying subtle dominance. "I specialize in global equity restructuring, high-value asset repositioning. Not many people in rooms like this understand that level of scale." My eyes tracked every inconsistency, without blinking. The phrasing was too polished, too generalized, like someone reciting power without ever holding it. No specific institutions. No verifiable structure. Just noise dressed as authority. My father laughed louder than I had ever heard him laugh at anything I had achieved. That sound alone told me everything I needed about where loyalty lived in this room. Richard's gaze returned to me again, sharper this time, as if he had decided I was the only variable he couldn't immediately categorize. "You seem observant," he said quietly, almost amused. I didn't answer. I simply studied him. The tailored suit, the perfect posture, the carefully controlled cadence of someone who had rehearsed importance, but not earned it. My silence was not hesitation, it was analysis. The chandelier above us shimmered faintly, casting fractured light across his face as he leaned just slightly closer, lowering his voice, so only I could hear. "You don't belong in rooms like this," he said. The words should have meant something. They would have once. But now they simply registered as data, another point of exposure. I met his gaze without blinking, my expression still, unreadable, as I silently marked the exact moment he believed he had the upper hand. And in that instant, I realized something critical. He wasn't testing my family. He was testing access. The moment his words settled into the air, "You don't belong in rooms like this," I felt something inside me lock into place, not emotionally but structurally, like a system shifting into a higher level of clarity. The brunch chatter around us continued under the soft chiming of crystal glasses, but I was no longer inside their version of the room. I was observing it, measuring it, mapping it. The air smelled faintly of citrus polish and expensive cologne, too clean to be honest, too curated to feel real. My knuckles stayed white under the tablecloth, chest steady, breathing controlled, as I watched Richard Hale's reflection bend slightly in the polished mahogany surface. Everything about him was tailored, sharp, intentional, but intention without truth always leaves traces. He thought he had positioned me beneath him. That misunderstanding alone told me everything I needed. My father's voice echoed again, louder when directed at Richard than it had ever been for me. "We're honored to have someone of your caliber here," he said, almost bowing in tone. The word caliber landed heavy, misplaced like borrowed respect that didn't belong to him either. Richard smiled, slow and practiced. "Well, I don't usually take meetings in environments like this, but I make exceptions for potential." A few guests chuckled softly, their laughter clacking against the crystalware like approval without understanding. I noted how easily they absorbed his language. Global equity restructuring, high-value repositioning, phrases that sounded powerful but carried no institutional anchor. No firm identifiers. No verifiable structure. Just performance. Inside me, something colder began forming. Not anger. Clarity sharpened to a razor point. I studied him the way I would study a failing balance sheet. Every pause, every eye movement, every overconfident tilt of his chin. My internal system was already tagging inconsistencies. Offshore claims without jurisdiction references. Investment returns without time frames. Authority without footprint. He leaned back slightly, confident enough now to expand his presence across the table. "Most people in corporate advisory don't understand real asset flow dynamics," he said, glancing briefly at me like I was included in that dismissal. "They operate at a transactional level, not strategic." My mother nodded too quickly. My father laughed again, sharper this time, as if validating Richard was more important than remembering who had built their financial stability indirectly through me. The sound of that laughter thudded against something deeper in my chest, but I kept my face still, controlled, observing. Richard's gaze returned to me again, lingering longer this time, as if trying to recalibrate what I represented in his mental hierarchy. "You're quiet," he said, almost amused. I answered nothing. Silence in my world was not absence, it was collection. The chandelier above us shimmered faintly as sunlight fractured through its crystal edges, scattering light across Richard's tailored shoulders. For a brief moment, the room felt artificially suspended, like time itself was waiting for someone to misstep. Then he leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough for me to hear, but not the table. "You've built yourself into something functional," he said softly. "But functionality is an influence. And influence is what matters in rooms like this." I noticed the subtle tremor in his confidence when he said it, so small most wouldn't detect it, but I did. Confidence always shakes at the edges when it's built on imitation. My internal temperature shifted again, colder this time, icy precision replacing passive observation. I wasn't being evaluated. I was being assessed for usefulness. That realization changed the entire equation, because usefulness means vulnerability, and vulnerability always leaves documentation somewhere. I slowly adjusted my posture, just slightly, letting my gaze rest on him without expression. Not challenge, not fear, just data reception. And for the first time since he entered the room, Richard Hale paused, almost imperceptibly, as if he had expected a reaction that never came. That pause told me more than everything he had said combined. And I began to wonder one thing that stayed long after the crystal glasses chimed again, and the conversation resumed around us like nothing had shifted at all. What exactly was he trying to access through my family, and why did he think I was the weakest point? The words Richard left behind were still echoing in my mind when I returned to my apartment that night, but it wasn't his arrogance that stayed with me. It was the pause he took when I didn't react. That silence had unsettled him more than anything he had said. And I realized something I couldn't ignore anymore. People only dismiss what they fear might already be watching them back. The air in my apartment felt colder than usual, glacial against my skin as I set my laptop down on the mahogany desk I had bought without telling anyone. The soft glow of the screen reflected faintly in the glass, and the sound of the system booting up clacked through the stillness like a warning. I accessed the internal audit channel through a secured portal I had built into my consulting infrastructure, quiet, invisible, layered beneath everything they thought they understood about my work. What I found there didn't make me react immediately. I never reacted immediately. I studied. Richard Hale's name appeared in fragmented financial trails, not clean enough to be legitimate, not consistent enough to be accidental. Offshore movement patterns without institutional anchors. Advisory fees routed through shell consultancy layers that didn't exist in any recognized registry. My knuckles tightened slightly against the edge of the desk, but my breathing remained steady, controlled, precise. This wasn't just inconsistency. It was architecture. Fraud built with confidence instead of discipline. A soft hum from the chandelier above me filled the silence of the room as I cross-referenced the data with 3 independent audit layers. Each layer confirmed the same thing. His credibility was a structure held together by borrowed perception, not financial truth. For the first time that night, something inside me shifted, not emotionally, but structurally. The temperature of my thinking turned icy, razor-sharp, removing every trace of hesitation I didn't need. I thought about the way my father had laughed at him, the way my mother had leaned in too quickly, the way Alina had smiled like approval was something to collect rather than question. And I knew exactly where this was heading. The next morning, I sat across from my father at the same dining table where I had once been reduced to background noise. The mahogany surface reflected everything too clearly now, like it had learned to observe instead of simply exist. I slid a printed summary of Richard's financial discrepancies toward him, without emotion. The paper clacked softly against the table. "This is what I found," I said evenly. My voice didn't rise. It never did. My father didn't even look at it immediately. Instead, he leaned back, exhaling like I had interrupted something irrelevant. "You went digging into his business?" he said sharply. "Out of jealousy?" My mother's voice followed instantly, almost rehearsed. "Maya, why can't you just be happy for your sister for once?" I didn't respond. I simply watched the way they avoided the document entirely, as if truth itself could be dismissed by refusal. My father finally glanced at it, scoffing. "These are assumptions. Nothing concrete. Richard operates at a level you don't understand." The words didn't hurt. They registered. There was a difference. "You're embarrassing yourself," he added, voice tightening. "Stop trying to undermine people who are actually successful." A faint sound of crystal clinking came from the sideboard as my mother adjusted a glass she wasn't drinking from, pretending discomfort with my presence rather than the content I had brought. In that moment, I realized I wasn't being evaluated on truth. I was being evaluated on obedience. I stood quietly, the chair behind me sliding back with a soft thud against the floor. No one reacted. They were already accustomed to ignoring me. But something inside me had already begun to detach. Not emotionally. Permanently. That night, alone again in my apartment, I replayed every dismissal, every laugh, every selective blindness. The silence wasn't just theirs anymore. It had been trained into me for years. I stood in front of the mirror, the reflection staring back at me under dim light, the room completely still except for my breathing. The realization didn't arrive gently. It struck clean and absolute, like a system rebooting itself. I heard my mother's voice again, not in the room, but in memory, sharp, casual, final. Maya was always too serious to be loved properly. Something inside me stopped absorbing after that sentence. The air in the room felt heavier, like the walls themselves were listening. My chest remained steady, but everything beneath it reorganized into something colder, something deliberate. I looked at my reflection longer than I ever had before. Not searching, deciding. And then it came, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute in its clarity. I am done being their silence. The words didn't echo. They settled. From that moment, my thinking no longer bent toward approval. It bent toward precision, toward consequence, toward inevitability. And somewhere in the distance of everything I now understood, I realized Richard Hale wasn't the problem anymore. He was the trigger. But triggers always lead to something far more dangerous. And I had not yet decided what I was going to aim at next. The silence I gave them after that moment in my apartment didn't fade, it hardened. It followed me like a second layer of skin as I arrived at the archive building where Elias Grant had asked me to meet him. Even the air outside felt different here, colder, more controlled, as if the city itself had learned to keep secrets in this place. Inside, the hallways smelled faintly of aged paper and polished wood, a mixture of history and containment. My footsteps echoed softly against the marble floor, each step measured, deliberate, the sound clacking into the stillness like a countdown I hadn't agreed to start but no longer intended to stop. Elias was waiting in a room lined with metal shelves and sealed cabinets, everything arranged with the precision of someone who understood that truth was rarely left in the open. The chandelier above flickered faintly, casting fractured light across stacks of documents that had outlived the people who created them. I didn't speak when I entered. I simply observed him the way I observed everything now, without interruption, without expectation. He studied me for a moment, then pushed a thick folder forward across the mahogany desk between us. The sound of it sliding was soft but final, like something being placed into motion that couldn't be reversed. I kept this hidden longer than I should have, Elias said, voice low and controlled. Your grandfather trusted me to protect it, and your father, he assumed I never would. I opened the folder slowly.
No urgency. No hesitation.
Just precision. Inside were documents layered with financial trails, trust agreements, offshore routing structures, and ownership transfers that didn't belong in any ethical framework of family legacy. My knuckles tightened slightly, but my expression remained still. The temperature in the room felt like it dropped a few degrees, glacial and absolute. Elias continued, watching me carefully. Your father didn't just mismanage the trust. He redirected it, systematically, over years, quietly. I absorbed the words without reaction, but inside me something recalibrated, an internal shift from observation to alignment. Not emotion. Strategy. He used your name in certain filings, Elias added. Not to give you control, but to create distance. Plausible deniability. That detail landed differently. Not sharp.
Clean.
Precise enough to be useful. I flipped another page. Offshore accounts. Layered entities. Shell advisories. A network designed not to build wealth, but to conceal its extraction. My father's voice from years of dismissal echoed faintly in memory, but it no longer carried authority. Only structure I could now see through. I've also flagged a pending federal compliance trigger, Elias said quietly. If activated, it will force full disclosure across every linked entity. The room felt quieter after that sentence, as if even the shelves were listening. The chandelier above us gave a faint chimed flicker, casting fractured light across the sealed dossier in my hands. I closed the folder slowly, letting the weight of it settle between us. Not emotional weight, legal weight. Structural consequence. Elias leaned back slightly. His voice lowered even further. If you activate this, he said, there's no going back. Not for your father. Not for your family. Not for anyone tied to it. I looked at him for the first time directly, fully. Not as an ally. Not as an observer. As a witness to a decision not yet executed. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of calculation. Full of futures branching in directions most people never see. I could feel the dossier like a living object in my hands now. Not paper, but leverage. Not information, but ignition. Outside, somewhere far beyond the archive walls, the world continued believing my family was intact, successful, respected, completely oblivious to the fact that the structure holding that illusion was already exposed in my hands. Elias didn't press again.
He didn't need to.
He had already delivered everything. Now it was only about what I would become in response to it. I stood slowly, the chair behind me sliding back with a soft thud against the floor. The sound felt heavier than it should have, like it marked the end of something that had never been officially named. I held the dossier against my side as I turned toward the exit. The corridor ahead felt longer now, not physically, but in consequence. Every step forward was no longer movement, it was selection. Elias spoke once more, almost reluctantly. "This doesn't just expose them," he said. "It replaces whatever version of you they think they know." I paused at the doorway, not turning back immediately. The air felt glacial against my skin, sharp enough to clarify thought into something dangerously clean. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet, steady, absolute. "I understand what it does." And I did. But what I didn't say was what I intended to do with it first. The silence I carried out of that archive room didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt engineered, controlled. Like something Elias had handed me wasn't just documentation, but a new operating system for the life I was still pretending to live inside. The city outside moved in its usual rhythm, headlights sliding across glass buildings, voices dissolving into distance, but I was no longer synchronized with it. Inside my mind, everything had reorganized into structure, into leverage, into timelines I could now see clearly for the first time. That night, I sat at my mahogany desk, the surface reflecting the soft glow of my secured screens. The air in my apartment felt colder than usual, glacial in a way that sharpened focus instead of discomfort. Somewhere behind me, the chandelier clicked faintly as the building adjusted to the night wind, a soft mechanical echo that sounded almost like confirmation. I began restructuring my financial position immediately. Not dramatically, not visibly. Quietly. The way real control moves, through permissions, transfers, silent authorizations that leave no emotional trace behind. My knuckles stayed steady on the keyboard, though beneath that calm precision, something irreversible had already started aligning. Every asset I touched responded like it had been waiting for instruction. Accounts reorganized. Authority layers adjusted. Control points shifted.
No noise. No disruption.
Just silent repositioning of power that had always been mine to claim, even if I had once been taught to ignore it. The next family gathering arrived like all the others, polished, curated, falsely warm. The dining room was filled with crystal reflections and controlled laughter, the chandelier above chiming softly every time someone moved too quickly into comfort. I entered without announcing anything beyond presence. My father glanced at me briefly, already dismissing me before I even sat down. My mother smiled too quickly, the kind of smile that assumes compliance rather than understanding. Alina adjusted her posture like she was preparing to be observed, not questioned. And Richard Hale, he watched differently. His eyes tracked me longer than necessary, as if something about my silence no longer matched the version of me he had already categorized. "You've been quiet lately," he said during dinner, voice smooth but edged. I didn't answer immediately. I observed instead. The way his confidence leaned forward when he felt control, the way he filled silence with performance, the way his tailored suit caught light from the crystal chandelier as though he belonged to it. My father laughed lightly. "She's always been like that, focused on internal things, not social things." The dismissal clacked across the table like a familiar sound I no longer reacted to. Richard leaned back slightly, studying me now with sharper intent.
"Interesting," he said.
"In my experience, silence usually means either uncertainty or surrender." My mother nodded quickly.
"Exactly.
Maya has always been intense, not like Alina. Alina understands softness." I noted that word, softness. How easily they confuse compliance with strength. Inside me, the shift was subtle but absolute. Every insult was no longer emotional input, it was structured data. Every dismissal became measurable. Every assumption became a future point of exposure. Richard continued, voice growing more confident as he performed for the room. I've actually been restructuring a number of cross-border portfolios recently, he said, glancing at my father. And I think your family's assets could align perfectly with what I'm building next. My father leaned in immediately. That sounds significant. Richard smiled.
It is.
I'm considering a formal partnership. Something long-term. High yield. Strategic positioning. The words floated across the table like manufactured authority. The guests nodded, impressed by language they didn't understand but trusted because it sounded expensive. I watched him carefully now, not as a participant, but as an analyst observing a system reaching its most confident failure state. He didn't notice the pause I made. He didn't notice that I had already mapped the structural connections behind everything he was offering. He didn't notice that every term he used had already been flagged, cross-referenced, and quietly validated against Elias's dossier. He was speaking into a room he believed was empty of resistance. And that was the most dangerous assumption he could make. My mother's voice broke into the conversation. This is exactly the kind of opportunity we've been waiting for, she said, glancing at me briefly. If everyone stays supportive, we can finally move forward as a family. As a family. The phrase landed differently now. Not warm. Not binding. Just conditional. Richard raised his glass slightly. The crystal chimed softly as it caught the light. To future collaboration, he said. The table responded with agreement, laughter, approval. All carefully timed reactions to a man they believed was elevation rather than exposure. I took a slow sip of water. My expression didn't change. My posture didn't shift. But internally, something colder aligned completely. Because what none of them knew, what none of them could possibly see, was that every structure Richard was now confidently stepping into was already mapped, already owned, already waiting for the moment I decided it no longer needed to exist in his hands at all. And as his voice continued filling the room with plans he believed were his future, I realized something precise and final. He wasn't building partnership. He was walking directly into jurisdiction I already controlled. The only question left was simple, and it settled inside me like a locked system waiting for activation. How long would I let him speak before the room realized he had never been in control of it at all? The moment I left that final meeting with Elias, the weight of what he placed in my hands didn't feel like paper anymore. It felt like containment. Something sealed not just in an envelope, but in consequence. Every step I took outside the archive building echoed against the pavement with a strange finality, as if the city itself understood that something irreversible had already been signed into motion. The air outside was glacial, sharp against my skin, cutting through thought until only structure remained. My fingers tightened around the sealed envelope resting inside my tailored coat, the edges firm, precise, unmoving. It wasn't heavy in the physical sense. It was heavy in outcome. Inside my apartment, the silence welcomed me like it always did now, not as absence, but as alignment. The chandelier above flickered softly, its light chiming faintly against the walls, reflecting off the mahogany desk where everything in my life now seemed to converge. I placed the envelope down without opening it. Not because I was uncertain, but because certainty had already been established elsewhere. What Elias had given me wasn't just evidence. It was activation protocol, a federal compliance trigger tied directly to Richard Hale's entire financial structure. Offshore layering, concealed advisory routes, falsified asset positioning. All of it locked behind one decision.
Meaning,
I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I observed the weight of it the way I now observed everything, without emotion interfering with function. My knuckles remained steady as I sat down, chest calm, breathing controlled, as if my body had finally agreed to match the precision of my mind. For the first time, there was no confusion in me, only sequencing. That night, I prepared for the next family gathering differently. Not as a daughter entering a room of expectations, but as a system entering a room of exposure. I selected my outfit carefully, sharp black tailored suit, structured shoulders, clean lines. Armor, not fashion. Every button aligned like intention. Every seam reinforced like control. When I arrived at the estate, The familiar scent of polished wood and expensive perfume hit me immediately. The mahogany doors opened into a world that still believed it understood itself. Crystal glasses clacked softly in anticipation. The chandelier above shimmered like it always did, beautiful, unaware. But something in the room shifted the moment I entered. Not loudly, not visibly, but enough that conversation softened at the edges, as if sound itself was recalibrating around my presence. My father looked up first. His expression carried that familiar dismissive certainty until it didn't. Until his eyes registered the difference in how I stood, how I moved, how I didn't seek acknowledgement anymore. My mother smiled automatically, then hesitated for half a second longer than usual, as if trying to match a version of me she could no longer locate. Alina glanced at me briefly, then looked away faster than she should have. And Richard Hale, he paused.
Just for a fraction. But I saw it.
That was enough. I took my seat without speaking. The chair didn't creak. Nothing broke the silence. But the air tightened anyway, as if it recognized structure entering a space built on assumption. Richard began speaking again almost immediately, attempting to reclaim rhythm. As I was saying, he continued smoothly, the restructuring opportunity one mentioned is already in motion. We're looking at full integration of your family's assets into a broader portfolio framework. My father nodded eagerly. That sounds extraordinary. Richard smiled, confident again. It is. I don't usually offer this level of access, but your family has potential if guided correctly. The word guided lingered in the air like misplaced authority. I didn't react. I simply observed him more clearly now. Every gesture, every pause, every overconfident breath between statements that assumed control he didn't possess. My knuckles rested lightly on the table, still, composed. My silence wasn't withdrawal anymore. It was preparation. My mother leaned slightly toward me, lowering her voice just enough to sound considerate. Maya, you should really listen carefully, she said. This could help all of us finally move forward. I looked at her briefly.
No emotion surfaced.
Only clarity. Forward, I thought. They believed forward still belonged to them. Richard raised his glass again, crystal chiming softly as it caught the chandelier light.
To expansion, he said.
The table echoed approval. And that was when I moved.
Slowly. Precisely. No announcement. No hesitation.
I placed the sealed envelope on the mahogany table. The sound of it touching the surface was soft, but it landed heavier than anything Richard had said all evening, a controlled thud that didn't require volume to dominate the room. No one spoke immediately. Richard glanced at it first, amused. What's this? I didn't answer. My father frowned. Maya, not now. Still, I said nothing. My silence filled the space between every breath in the room, structured and deliberate, until even the chandelier above seemed quieter. Richard leaned slightly forward, attempting to reassert familiarity. If this is some internal report, I can assure you. I interrupted nothing. I simply watched, because interruption implies participation. And I was no longer participating. The envelope remained unopened on the table between us, perfectly still, perfectly neutral, holding within it something none of them were prepared to understand yet. And as I studied their faces, confused, dismissive, slightly unsettled, I realized the most important shift had already happened. They still thought silence meant nothing. But I already knew what silence becomes right before everything breaks open. And I had not yet decided who would be the first to open it. The envelope had barely left my hand on that mahogany table when the shift began, not in the room, but in the structure beneath everything Richard Hale thought he controlled. And I felt it before I saw it. That subtle internal recalibration, like pressure changing in a sealed system. I was alone in my apartment when the first notification arrived through my secured channel. No names.
No noise.
Just confirmation. Federal audit initiated. Asset containment in progress. The chandelier above me flickered faintly, casting fractured light across the pristine surface of my desk. The air felt different immediately, still, glacial, as if even the building understood something irreversible had begun moving through the system.
I didn't stand. I didn't react.
My chest remained steady, breathing controlled, my knuckles resting lightly against the edge of the mahogany desk. Emotion had no place in timing. Timing was everything now. By the time Richard's office doors opened that morning, the silence in my world had already become consequence in his. From a distance, I watched through internal financial feeds I no longer needed to interpret, only observe. Federal auditors entered his space without ceremony, no warning that mattered, no explanation he could interrupt. Just authority arriving in its purest form. The sound of it wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Shoes against polished floor. Documents clacked onto desks. A calm voice repeating procedures that could not be argued with. Richard's office, once built on tailored confidence and crystal-clear illusion, began to fracture in real time. Accounts frozen. Transfers halted. Advisory routes flagged. Every structure he built around perception began collapsing under the weight of verification. And still, I felt nothing like chaos. Only alignment. My fingers rested still on the desk as I monitored the cascading confirmations. Each update echoed faintly through my system like controlled detonations. Clean, precise, inevitable. He had stepped into my jurisdiction without realizing it wasn't theoretical. It was active. My family, of course, had no idea. They were still orbiting Richard's presence like he was gravity itself, still repeating his language, still believing his confidence was currency. My mother had texted me earlier that morning. Richard is finalizing the partnership structure. Try to be supportive. I didn't respond. Support was no longer part of the equation I was working within. At exactly 2:14 p.m., the first internal panic trace appeared in Richard's network. I saw it before anyone in his circle could interpret it. Rapid authorization failures, halted liquidity access, institutional locks engaging across multiple jurisdictions. The sound of collapse, in my world, was silent, but structured. And then my phone rang.
Richard Hale.
I let it ring once.
Twice.
The screen illuminated my hand with a cold glow, reflecting off the glass surface of my desk like a warning I had already accounted for. On the third ring, I answered, not because I owed him access, but because I wanted him to experience the absence of it. For a moment, only breathing filled the line. Rattled. Unstable. Then his voice broke through. Maya, what is happening? My accounts are frozen. There are federal auditors in my office. This has to be a misunderstanding. I stayed silent for a beat longer than comfort allowed him. Silence, I had learned, was not absence. It was pressure. Do you hear me? He said again, sharper now. This is my entire structure. Someone has interfered. I finally spoke, my voice even, controlled, glacial in its calm. Interference suggests you were stable to begin with. A pause. I could hear movement in the background, voices, papers, procedural commands. The sound of authority dismantling illusion. Richard exhaled sharply, chest heaving through the line. This is you, he said, lower now, as if the realization itself tasted unfamiliar. It's connected to you somehow.
Tell me what you did.
I looked out through my apartment window as the city moved beneath me, unaware of the system collapsing inside its own reflection. I didn't do anything, I said quietly. I documented. Another pause. Longer this time. You think this end with me? He asked, voice tightening, fraying at the edges of control. You don't understand what you've stepped into. My fingers rested still against the desk.
No tremor. No sift.
Only precision. I understand exactly what I stepped into, I replied. You just didn't understand where you were standing. A distant sound came through the call, something falling. A thud. Then voices rising. The structure around him was no longer stable enough to hide behind tone. You've ruined everything, he said finally, the words collapsing into something closer to panic than accusation. You don't realize who I am connected to. That was the moment clarity fully locked into place. Not fear. Not reaction. Just confirmation. Every system reveals itself when it begins to fail. I stood slowly from my chair, the chandelier above me chiming faintly as if acknowledging the movement. The room remained perfectly still otherwise, but the air had shifted, cleaner, colder, absolute. I know exactly who you are connected to, I said. That's why it worked. Silence hit the line. Heavy, final. And then, softer, almost broken, his voice returned. What did you do to me? I looked at the reflection of my own face in the darkened window glass, calm and unchanged. You built on assumptions, I said. I built on verification. The line went quiet again, but this time it wasn't confusion. It was realization forming too late to reverse. And as I ended the call without another word, I understood something simple and irreversible. Power doesn't shift when it is taken. It shifts when the person holding it realizes they were never holding it at all. My phone went dark in my hand, and somewhere in the distance, Richard Hale was still trying to understand what part of his world had just stopped belonging to him, and whether I was ever truly outside it in the first place. The moment I ended that call, I already knew Richard Hale would try to rebuild control the only way people like him know how, through visibility, performance, and public validation. And tonight, he had chosen the perfect stage for it. A charity gala surrounded by crystal chandeliers, tailored suits, and elite witnesses who believed appearances were proof of truth. The venue was pristine, almost unreal in its symmetry. Crystal glasses chimed softly with every toast, echoing across marble floors polished to reflect status rather than reality. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and staged confidence, the kind of environment where truth usually gets diluted before it can be heard. I stood near the back of the hall, unseen by most, my tailored black suit blending into the architecture rather than competing with it. My posture was still, controlled, my presence reduced on purpose, not hidden, but contained. Observation required distance. Richard was already at the center. His voice carried easily across the room, confident, rehearsed, expanding with every sentence like he was feeding on attention itself. My father stood near him, nodding too quickly. My mother smiled like approval was oxygen. Alina lingered at the edge of influence, watching him like he had already rewritten her future. And Richard, he was performing. We are currently restructuring multi-regional portfolios, he said smoothly, raising his glass so the chandelier light clacked across the crystal surface. This level of capital movement requires precision most advisory circles simply don't understand. A few guests laughed softly, impressed by language they didn't need to understand to accept. I watched the pattern unfold with glacial clarity. He wasn't speaking to inform. He was speaking to secure belief. His eyes drifted across the room before settling on me. A pause. A recognition of something he still thought he could override. And of course, he added, voice sharpening slightly, we are integrating legacy family structures that have been underutilized. The phrase landed exactly where he intended. My father straightened. My mother nodded again. Then Richard smiled, turning fully toward me. Even individuals who are more operational than strategic have roles in these transitions, he said, the words carrying polite dismissal wrapped in arrogance. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the audience. Crystal glasses chimed lightly. The chandelier above shimmered as if approving the performance. My knuckles tightened once beneath my coat, not out of emotion, but calibration. Cold, biting precision settling deeper inside me. He thought this was still a narrative he controlled. Then the room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but structurally. The entrance doors opened with a controlled thud that cut clean through the gala's rhythm. The sound wasn't disruption, it was authorization. A small group entered.
No urgency. No announcement.
Just presence backed by institutional weight. Federal auditors. The shift was immediate. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Glasses paused midair. Even the chandelier seemed to hold its movement for a fraction longer than expected. Richard noticed at last. At first, he smiled, still performing, still believing visibility protected him. He said lightly, turning toward them. Perfect timing. I assume this is regarding our expansion filings. The lead auditor stepped forward, calm, precise, carrying documents that didn't need explanation. Richard Hale, the auditor said evenly. We are here under federal compliance authority. Your financial structures have triggered a full audit freeze. The words did not echo. They settled. Heavy. Final. I watched the exact moment his confidence tried to hold shape, and failed. My structures are fully compliant, Richard said quickly, voice tightening just slightly. There must be an error. I work with international advisory frameworks. The auditor didn't react. Just placed the document on a nearby table. The sound of paper touching would clack louder than the entire room's silence. Your offshore routing is unregistered, the auditor continued. Your advisory entities do not match declared jurisdiction filings. A murmur spread through the guests like cold air leaking into a sealed room. My father's expression shifted. My mother's smile disappeared entirely. Alina stepped back slightly. Richard's voice rose now, sharper, breaking control. This is interference, he said. I have partnerships, confirmed capital movement, validated investor structures, none of which exist in verified systems, the auditor interrupted calmly. That was the fracture point. Not anger, not panic, exposure. I observed it all without movement. My emotional temperature remained unchanged, icy, controlled, razor-sharp clarity cutting through every reaction in the room. Richard turned slightly, scanning faces now instead of controlling them. And then his eyes found me again. Something shifted in his expression, confusion collapsing into recognition, then recognition collapsing into something heavier. You, he said, voice lower now, unstable. This was you. The room didn't move. Even the chandelier above seemed still. I didn't answer immediately. Silence stretched between us, deliberate, structured, absolute. He stepped forward slightly, voice cracking at the edges of control. You did this, he said again, quieter this time, as if speaking it louder would make it less real. Every guest was watching now. Crystal glasses held midair. Breath suspended. Reality fully exposed. I finally met his gaze directly.
No emotion. No urgency.
Just clarity. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself a single expression. A smile. Not warmth. Not satisfaction. Precision. Because in that moment he understood something too late to stop. And I already knew the only question left was not what would happen next, but how far he would fall before he realized I was never reacting to him at all. The moment Richard said my name in front of everyone at the gala, something in me didn't rise or fall. It stabilized. Like a system finally confirming what it had been building toward all along. I didn't react to the shock in the room. I had already moved past shock days ago. What remained now was structure collapsing exactly as predicted. By the time I returned to the family house, the air inside already felt different. Heavier. Not warmer, not colder, just unstable. The kind of stillness that exists right before something fractures beyond repair. The chandelier in the entryway chimed softly as I stepped in, its light reflecting off polished surfaces that suddenly felt too clean for what was about to happen inside them. My father was standing in the living room when I entered. Not seated. Not composed. Standing too rigidly, as if his body hadn't yet agreed with the information it had received. Papers were scattered across the mahogany table, statements, notices, frozen asset confirmations. The sound of them shifting as he moved was sharp, rattled, uncontrolled. He saw me immediately. This is your doing, he said, voice tight, almost breaking at the edges. You brought this into this family. I didn't answer. I simply observed him the way I used to observe financial inconsistencies, without emotion, only verification. Behind him, my mother was already pacing, her voice rising in uneven fragments. We trusted you, she said sharply, turning toward me. We let you handle things because you said you were capable, and now everything is collapsing. Her words weren't logic. They were panic trying to disguise itself as accusation. Alina stood near the staircase, silent for once. Her usual posture, the practiced softness, the curated privilege was gone. She clutched her phone like it might restore something that no longer existed. Her voice, when it finally came, was smaller than I had ever heard it. My cards, they're not working, she said. That was the moment it became real for them. Not the legal notices. Not the frozen accounts. Not even Richard's exposure. It was the loss of access. The collapse of convenience. I stood in the center of it all, still, composed, my presence no longer blending into the room, but defining its imbalance. The air felt glacial around me, as if the house itself had finally acknowledged a new internal structure. My father stepped forward, frustration turning into something sharper. "You are always jealous of her," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Alina. "You've been waiting for this moment to destroy everything just because you were never the center of it." The accusation landed exactly where it was meant to hurt, but it didn't land anymore. It simply passed through. My mother's voice followed immediately, trembling now, less controlled. "If you had just supported Richard properly, none of this would have happened. You don't understand how opportunities work." I looked at her for a long moment, not as a daughter, not as a participant, but as someone finally seeing the full pattern without distortion. "This was never about opportunity," I said quietly. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was about exposure. The words seemed to destabilize something in them further than any document had. My father's face tightened. "You think this makes you powerful?" he said. "You think destroying your own family proves anything?" A faint sound of glass shifting echoed from the side table as my mother reached for a crystal glass she didn't drink from, her hands trembling just slightly. I took one step back, then another, not in retreat, but in completion. Behind them, the house felt different now. The mahogany furniture, the crystal fixtures, the curated luxury they had always used as proof of stability, it all looked temporarily unanchored, as if it no longer knew who it belonged to. "I didn't destroy anything," I said. "I removed what was already unstable." That was when the shouting began. Overlapping voices, accusations, panic turning into noise. My father's voice clacked against the walls, my mother's tremor rising into something closer to collapse, Alina's silence finally breaking into fragmented disbelief. But I wasn't listening anymore. I had already heard everything that mattered. I walked toward the door slowly.
No urgency. No hesitation.
My tailored coat shifted slightly with each step, structured, controlled. Armor rather than clothing. Behind me, my father called out again, voice cracking. "You're still our daughter," he said, as if the label still carried authority. I stopped at the threshold, but didn't turn back. The chandelier light behind me chimed faintly, fractured across the hallway, like something already separating into pieces. "That was never the part that gave you power over me," I said. Silence followed. Not immediate understanding, but the absence of anything left to argue with. I stepped outside. The air was colder than before, razor-sharp against my skin, but it felt clean now, unclaimed. And as I walked away from the house without a single look back, I realized something simple and irreversible had already happened inside them long before I left. The family didn't break when the money disappeared. They broke when they realized I was no longer holding them together. The silence I left behind at my family house didn't stay there. It spread outward, slowly, structurally, like a system collapsing beyond its original point of failure. And I felt every echo of it as I sat alone in my office days later, watching the final phase of Richard Hale's downfall unfold in controlled, documented precision. The first confirmation came through my secured feed, formal detention, financial fraud charges processed, asset seizure protocols executed.
No dramatic announcement. No spectacle.
Just institutional certainty arriving where performance used to exist. The air in my office felt glacial, steady, controlled. The mahogany desk beneath my hands reflected the soft light of the chandelier above, its crystal edges chiming faintly whenever the building shifted against the wind. Everything here was pristine, untouched by the chaos it was indirectly shaping. I didn't react. My chest remained calm, breathing even, knuckles resting lightly against the edge of the desk. Emotion had already finished its role in this process. What remained was observation. Across the city, the ripple effect began exactly as predicted. The same social circle that once laughed at Richard's words began dissolving his presence in real time. Invitations vanished. Messages went unanswered. Names once attached to his confidence now detached themselves with quiet urgency. It wasn't rejection. It was self-preservation disguised as distance. I watched it unfold without interruption. Every withdrawal echoed louder than any confrontation ever could. Crystal invitations clacked into digital silence. Conversations that once carried his name now avoided it entirely, as if even mentioning him risked contamination. And then came the family fallout. My father's voice, when I received the brief message from him, was no longer authoritative. It was reduced, stripped. "You've done enough," he said through a strained call, the connection rattled with instability. "This is going too far. You've exposed all of us." I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch long enough for him to feel it. "You don't understand the damage," he added. "Our name, our standing, everything is collapsing." My mother's voice entered next, sharper but fractured. "If you had just warned us properly," she said, "none of this would have reached this level." That was the moment I recognized the pattern fully. Even collapse, to them, was still something I was expected to manage for them. I ended the call without response. Outside my office window, the city moved as if nothing had changed. But I knew better now. Change rarely announces itself loudly. It dismantles quietly until only structure remains where illusion used to stand. Alina's message arrived later that night. It was short, unstable. "I got a job," she wrote. "They said I start tomorrow. I don't think I understand any of this yet."
No apology, no blame.
Just exposure to reality, without insulation. I read it once and set the phone down, because that was the final shift no one in my family had prepared for. Not loss of wealth, not public embarrassment, but the loss of dependency itself. The systems they built their identity on were gone. And without them, they had nothing left to project onto me. I stood slowly from my chair, walking toward the glass wall of my office. The chandelier light behind me chimed softly, fractured reflections stretching across the floor like broken continuity. The air felt colder now, but not uncomfortable, clarified. For the first time, I was not reacting to collapse. I was beyond it. The legal files were closed. The structures were dismantled. Richard was contained. My family was dispersed into reality they could no longer negotiate with. And I remained, untouched. But as I looked out over the city, I realized something subtle had shifted, not in them, but in me. Because silence had done its job completely now. And silence, once finished speaking, always waits for what comes next. The silence I left behind after everything collapsed did not fade, it settled. Not like absence, but like structure finally completed. And now, standing alone in my office, I could see every outcome clearly, without distortion, without emotion interfering with precision. The city outside moved under a glacial sky, distant and indifferent. Inside, the chandelier above me chimed faintly with each subtle shift in the air, its crystal edges scattering light across a room that no longer felt like a battleground, just a conclusion. My tailored suit rested perfectly against my frame, not armor anymore, but identity fully reclaimed. My father's downfall had not been dramatic in the way people imagine ruin. It was slower, more humiliating in its quietness. Public acknowledgments reduced to careful apologies. Business ties dissolved without explanation. His voice, once absolute, now carried hesitation even in private calls. I didn't understand the scale of what was happening, he had said earlier that week, his tone restrained, almost rehearsed. But understanding was never the requirement. Accountability was. My mother's collapse was different. Not financial, but social. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations stopped continuing when she entered rooms. Even her closest allies shifted their language around her, as if proximity alone could transfer consequence. "They're just being cautious," she told me once, her voice thin, clacked with forced denial. But caution, I understood now, was simply fear wearing polite language. Alina's message came again a few days later.
Shorter this time.
More grounded. "I got paid," she wrote. "It's not much, but it feels real." There was no entitlement in her words anymore.
No expectation.
Only adaptation. And Richard, his chapter had already been sealed. Legal structures, financial systems, reputational frameworks, all dismantled under the weight of verified truth.
No speeches. No redemption arc.
Just documentation doing its work without emotion. Each of them had reached their own version of the same place, reality, without insulation. And I had not raised my voice once. I turned slowly from the window, facing the center of my office. The mahogany desk beneath my hands was still, solid, unbothered by everything it had witnessed. Crystal reflections from the chandelier moved faintly across its surface, like memory, without attachment. That was when I finally spoke, not to any of them, but beyond them, to whoever was listening, whoever needed to understand.
My voice was calm.
Controlled. Final in a way that did not invite interpretation. I used to think silence meant being ignored, I said. I used to think it meant I didn't matter. I paused, feeling the weight of everything that had led here, not as pain, but as structure completing itself. But silence was never absence. It was observation. It was documentation. It was timing. The room did not respond. It didn't need to. I stepped closer to the desk, my reflection faint in the glass surface of the city beyond. The temperature in the room felt glacial now, not because of cold air, but because everything unnecessary had finally been removed. You don't have to raise your voice to reclaim your life. I continued, slower now, each word deliberate. You just have to stop giving it away. A final breath. Not emotional, controlled, settled. Everything I had once carried as noise was gone now. What remained was clarity so sharp it no longer needed justification. My family was no longer a system, I was inside. Richard was no longer a threat, I had to anticipate. The world no longer required me to shrink, translate, or soften. Only truth remained. And truth, I understood now, did not need volume. It only needed completion. I looked once more at the chandelier above me, its crystal light steady, unmoving, as if even it understood the ending had already been written long before I spoke it aloud. And then I allowed the final thought to land, not as memory, not as emotion, but as closure. I chose silence, I said softly. A pause. And it spoke for me.